Welcome to another edition of Daily Airline News. I'm Geoffrey Thomas, and I'm delighted to say, joined by my co-host Richard Godfrey in Frankfurt. Good morning to you, Richard.
And good afternoon to you, Geoffrey.
Tis. Viewers, this episode is 259, Fascinating Lessons. And we'll start off with a comment from Ben Humphreys, 1656. Richard and Geoffrey, each daily episode has either contained a fascinating lesson or has featured intriguing and searching questions. Thank you very much for the pure entertainment and for the unrelenting drive to increase understanding of the horrifying and tragic Air India 171 disaster. I wonder what obstacles may exist towards the public obtaining the complete flight data records and whether their release for scrutiny may be requested under Freedom of Information legislation. I'm more than confident that you two guys could gain a tremendous amount from examining the flight data. And also another comment from Dave from Melbourne, 1237. You have the most in-depth commentary on this matter. It's been fascinating following this investigation. Keep up the great work. Well, Richard, you've been following aviation for a long, long time too, haven't you?
Yeah, and the point about the freedom of information, those requests have been made of the Indian authorities and ended with a blank.
Mm.
Several Indian citizens have made freedom of information requests, and all have drawn a blank so far. Yeah, you're right, Geoffrey. I first sat in a captain's seat on a commercial aircraft at the age of 7. I got my glider pilot license at the age of 16 and my single engine pilot license at 17. And my career as an aerospace engineer started back in 1972 after I graduated from university. And I worked on avionics systems for Boeing and for Airbus. I worked on the Tornado, the F-16 and the A-7 military aircraft. I spent 5 years on the NASA and ESA joint program for building Space Lab, and I built a simulator of the shuttle. When I narrowly missed being on Air France 447, that was a life-changing experience. And I immediately got involved in the investigation into the disappearance of MH370, which is, of course, still ongoing. And over the last 4 years, I've been developing a form of global passive radar system based on the so-called whisper data. So, all in all, 60 years of experience in flying and aviation. But Geoffrey, you've also got 60 years experience in flying and aviation. And you told me a very interesting story when Qantas asked you to help with a court case they had in London. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. But I should tell viewers I started my interest in aviation extremely young. Um, yeah, look, in 2008, Qantas had a advertising campaign claiming to be the world's most experienced airline, and this was run in the United Kingdom, and the Advertising Standards Association of the United Kingdom was bombarded with complaints from folks in Britain claiming that there's no way Qantas could make that claim of being the world's most experienced airline, and therefore they had to justify it. Well, Qantas came up with a couple of reasons, 3 reasons in fact, and the Advertising Standards Association knocked those back. So they reached out to me and my wife Christine and said, can you prove this? We've sent through 3 reasons, which were really quite silly, and we've been knocked back, and we're in strife. So we put together a document which was 4,000 pages, 4,000 words long, which listed 26 firsts and seconds that Qantas could claim that they were the world's most experienced airline, and the airline won the case. So when you see an advertising slogan around the world says Qantas, the world's most experienced airline, which I'm showing on the screen right now, that's because of what we did. So that was rather an interesting exercise. Now, John Potter, Kilo 8 Romeo, says, in regard to the Air Itavia crash mentioned in episode 257, there was a final report carried out by the international team led by a British engineer. The aircraft was rebuilt in a hangar, and that team proved conclusively that a bomb in the starboard rear washroom brought the aircraft down. The team produced a comprehensive report, which was handed to the Italian authorities, who promptly filed it away. As per my previous comment, look out for David Learmont's withering review of the Italians. Now, David's a colleague of ours. He is a safety expert with Flight Global. Richard.
Yeah, the crash of Itavia Flight 870 on the 27th of June 1980 involved a McDonnell Douglas DC-9-15, registration I-TIGI. And it remains one of the most disputed aviation events in European aviation history. The flight was from Bologna in Italy to Palermo in Sicily and crashed near the island of Ustica, about 52 kilometers north of Palermo on the island of Sicily. The technical cause has never officially and conclusively been established, and that is after decades of investigations, court rulings, expert work, and two major hypotheses still remain. And one of those was effectively endorsed by the Italian courts. And the Italian civil courts, not the aviation safety agencies, ultimately concluded the DC-9 was destroyed by a missile in an air-to-air dogfight combat. And Italian aviation safety bodies and investigators in the 1980s and the 1990s initially leaned towards a bomb placed in the rear lavatory. And on the 18th of July 1980, shortly after the accident, a Libyan MiG-23 MS was crashed in the mountains near Castelcigliano in Calabria, southern Italy. And that jet was from the Al-Geoffrey air base in Libya and was suspected as being involved in a dogfight near the area where the DC-9 crashed. The fact is, however, that this area, the crash area, is out of the operational range of a MiG-23 from Al-Geoffrey, but within fuel range for a one-way trip to where it crashed on fuel exhaustion in the mountains. And witnesses involved in the search for the MiG-23 at the time report that the date it was found was well before the date of the crash of the DC-9. And a guy called Frank Taylor from Cranfield University in the UK, which is a world-leading aviation institute, was invited as an expert witness to review all the various investigations. And he went through the court hearings and the various technical commissions. He was, by the way, also involved in the Lockerbie bombing as an investigator. And Frank produced a 15-page report, and these are his conclusions from that report. Number one, failing to differentiate between perfectly reasonable assumptions and proven facts can lead to the production of extremely convincing but ultimately incorrect conclusions. The not inconsiderable circumstantial evidence that a missile or missiles brought down the DC-9 was not supported by the evidence from the aircraft wreckage. The study of the wreckage recovered from the seabed provided the key lessons to the investigation. Several years after completion of the technical investigation, the finding that the Itavia DC-9 broke up as a result of an internal explosion still stands. But although this has not been seriously challenged, it's still not accepted by all parties. The reason for this is unknown, but is thought not to be of a technical nature. And finally, he says, despite the integrity and impartiality of individuals involved, the judicial system used in Italy and in some other countries to investigate aircraft accidents is not appropriate to a complex technical accident investigation. Investigation should be vested in a totally independent specialist agency as called for by the European Commission.
Now, Sam Daniels, Richard, says, you also need to look at the Air India Flight 101 from Delhi to JFK on the 11th of September 2018, which almost ended in the loss of 360 lives. Why did the aircraft leave Delhi without a functioning APU, as opposed to being switched off? Why did so many unrelated systems, including the ILS and multiple sensitive instruments, fail on the flight? The aircraft was flying back to India as a ferry flight. Neither the incident report nor the investigation report were released by Air India. What was Air India hiding? We know of this one, but how many other flights like it have been swept under the carpet? There appears to be a pattern of negligence, maintenance issues, and cover-ups. Richard, that's a fascinating one.
It is indeed. And as the flight neared the New York area, the aircraft experienced multiple system failures. 2 of the 3 radio altimeters failed, and the third, a radio altimeter, appeared compromised. And because of those altimeter failures, the aircraft's instrument landing capability, the ILS auto-land system, was severely impacted. And the TCAS, the traffic collision avoidance system, and other systems were reported as non-functional. And the weather in the New York area at the time was poor, a very low cloud base, about 200 feet in places, and very low visibility. The crew initially attempted a landing at JFK, but performed a go-around, a missed approach procedure because of the unstable approach and the lack of reliable instrumentation. And at that point, the fuel situation became critical. The pilots reported, and I quote, "We are really, stuck, and there's no fuel," end of quote. They diverted to Newark EWR in New Jersey, where they managed a visual approach, since they couldn't rely on the ILS, an autoland system, and they landed safely with no loss of life. The operator, Air India, later described the landing as, and I quote, "a remarkable achievement," end of quote, of the pilots under very difficult circumstances. And you're quite right in your comment. I couldn't find any publicly released investigation report, not from the AAIB in India, nor from the NTSB in the US, nor from Boeing or any other source. And so we don't have the full documentation of all the causal factors or any safety recommendations. What we do have is the ATC audio transcripts, and we have Air India internal statements. And by ICAO standards, this should have triggered at least a serious incident investigation. And in the US, even minor incidents often produce a NTSB incident report. And the AAIB in India normally issues reports for far less severe events. And sometimes you even get Boeing and Honeywell or other manufacturers issuing service information if there are radio altimeter failures that cascade. But this incident occurred on 9/11 in the New York airspace, which is a very sensitive date. And AI 101's track record of multiple aggregators from Flight Radar 24 or ADSB Exchange or Radar Box gives us the ADSB data. And that shows some interesting points. The ADSB showed normal reporting except during the approach, and no extended transponder dropouts en route, no altitude quantization errors until the failed approach at JFK. And during the missed approach, the barometric altitude report appeared intermittently and inconsistent data compared with the radio altimeter. So there was a cross-system degradation. And the ADSB altitude uses the air data computer, the barometric altitude, not the radio altimeter. However, failures in the radio altimeter subsystem can cascade through the ground proximity warning system, the auto-land capability, the auto-throttle logic, and the mode control logic. But they do not corrupt the ADSB barometric altitude. And here's a really interesting bit. The 777 fleet from Boeing did have radio altimeter related intermittent fault issues in this time frame, but these were not widely publicized. Boeing issued internal maintenance communications, but not public service bulletins or airline level guidance. And intermittent radio altimeter failures were tied to wiring harness moisture ingress, especially in humid climates like India. And radio altimeter failures linked to ARINC 429 bus short-term packet loss, and issues with the Honeywell KRA 405B and 455B units on aging aircraft. Now, these did not trigger an airworthiness directive because the failures were intermittent and they did not present a systemic fleet-wide hazard. They were mitigated by existing maintenance procedures. And in 2018, 2019, several airlines reported on the Boeing 777 dual radio altimeter faults. Emirates reported multiple occurrences, particularly after heavy rain. American Airlines intermittent left radio altimeter failures. Air France and KLM on their Boeing 777 fleet, occasional radio altimeter cross-channel disagreement alerts, and ANA and JAL also reported isolated faults on the radio altimeter. But here's the thing. Air India's maintenance state back in 2018 was degraded. AI Engineering Services Limited had issues in 2018, recurrent shortage of spare line replaceable units, and they were doing parts cannibalization between aircraft. and they had deferred items near the MEL limits. The DGCA in India did audits and found lapses in avionic checks, including radio altimeter and TCAS items. And the 77 fleet from Air India was known to have intermittent avionic issues, especially in the nose bay electronics equipment.
Interesting tale, that one, Richard. Now, Joe Costigas, 1298. Richard, generally speaking, would you agree that most, if not all, airline incident investigations are compromised by subjectivity, nationalist interest, etc.? That seems to be the case from my perspective as a curious observer. The degree of compromise obviously will vary, but compromise they certainly seem to be. Now, Richard, that's a very interesting question. And before you answer it, let me relate a tale that of something that's happened with us with ICAO. So we, in my former company, Airline Ratings, we developed the world's first airline safety rating system. And when we launched that in 2013, ICAO requested that we come to Montreal to explain our system. And because they were asked by the United Nations to develop a safety rating system. So we went to Montreal, we did a workshop with them, and they endorsed our system and they adopted our system. So ICAO adopted our system. And so when we launched Safety Awards, we announced that our system was endorsed by ICAO, and we used their emblem with their blessing. But after a couple of years, we were told we can't do that anymore. And we inquired as to why. And the public relations guy said, I'm terribly, terribly sorry, but quite a number of the countries where you give them a very low rating for their airlines have complained to us, and therefore we can no longer say it's endorsed by ICAO. So these countries where their safety was seriously substandard did not like the light being shone on them and complained to ICAO, and therefore we couldn't endorse our ratings with the ICAO label, which kind of defeats the purpose, Richard.
Yeah, absolutely defeats the purpose. And, rather than complain to ICAO that there's a safety system being used, why not improve your safety record, dear countries? And, when Joe asked the question, are the safety compromises and are those subjective and nationalist interests? You have to say, yes, there are definitely subjective and nationalist interests at play. And it makes a mockery of having a worldwide safety system and pulling people up who fall short of the safety standards. So my advice to those countries is sort your safety problems out.
But to Joe's question, I think there are many, many investigations that are compromised.
Yeah, but I don't think it's the majority.
No.
I think there is a substantial number. We've listed quite a few. And those ones we need to investigate further ourselves and follow up. But the vast majority are done properly. And you can bet your bottom dollar that if someone from one of the major countries using airlines like the US or some of the European or Asian or Australian, New Zealand, then I don't know. But my impression is, generally speaking, ATSB in Australia, BEA in France, NTSB, the UK, AAIB, do a pretty thorough job in investigations. Yes, there are instances where the FAA is in conflict with the NTSB, but it's not like, for example, on the China Eastern, where we get a one-page report, which is a complete whitewash of the situation. So it does vary enormously from one country to another.
And here we're going to go straight into a very controversial accident. And Louis Boshoff, 9142, says, yes, I agree with all your opinions and facts regarding Air India 171. Another example of the bias of aircraft accident investigation is the Concorde crash in France. That's the Air France Concorde crash in 2000. The book Concorde by Mike Bannister, a Concorde pilot, covers this. And what we've done here, Richard, we've actually found a YouTube video, which there's a link below, from another Concorde pilot, John Hutchinson. Now, Mike Bannister was a senior BA Concorde pilot, and John Hutchinson also. Now, this crash happened on the 25th of July 2000, and 109 people, everybody on board, died. At a Royal Aeronautical Society lecture, John Hutchinson, who was a British Airways Concorde pilot, delivered a fascinating and astonishing account of the Air France Concorde crash. And he presented clear evidence and alleged that the French authorities who conducted the crash investigation covered up the true cause and tried to blame Continental Airways engineers and design weaknesses in the Concorde. The truth is, according to Captain Hutchinson and Mike Bannister, Air France was totally to blame. Now, firstly, their maintenance procedures were poor. During an undercarriage service, a spacer which kept the wheels tracking straight was not replaced. The spacer was later found on the shelf in the maintenance hangar. The aircraft had done 4 flights with this defect prior to the crash, so it wasn't the prime cause, but as with all accidents, there were a number of other areas that all added up. The first officer's license had expired, making the flight illegal. This wasn't a factor in the crash, but demonstrates an unprofessional attitude. The main fault lies with the captain, who overrode a procedure and ordered the tanks this is the fuel tanks, to be filled to the brim instead of the normal 82 to 83% fuel. In other words, there was no airspace left in the tanks. He also ordered more fuel, 3 tons. That was required to be put in the aft tanks for taxing. He also allowed another 19 bags that had not been weighed to be loaded into the aft hold. All this made the aircraft overweight by 3.5 tonnes and the C of G out of limits. Captain Hutchinson estimates the bags would have been about 500 kilos. By the time the plane left after an hour delay to fix a thrust reverser, it was surprisingly quiet at Charles de Gaulle, and so the captain didn't use up as much fuel in the taxi out and only burnt, in fact, 800 kilos. So the Concorde was now 3 tonnes overweight and out of balance. Now, due to the weight and the balance being out of limits, he requested to use the runway extension, even though it was officially out of use because it was being resurfaced. He also elected to take off with an 8-knot tailwind despite being 3 tonnes overweight, which means it was effectively now 8 tonnes overweight. The French investigation verdict was that the crash was caused by a metal strap falling off a Continental Airways DC-10 onto the runway, which burst a tyre which punctured the Concorde's fuel tank, starting a fire. However, what really happened was that as the aircraft accelerated over the unprepared part of the runway, it hit the lip as it crossed onto the newly resurfaced part of the runway at about 100 knots. This caused the wheels to track to the left as they had no spacer to constrain them. The tyres overheated and burst, starting a fire which was observed by another Air France pilot in a Boeing 767. The aircraft slewed off the runway to the left, hit a runway light and the Continental Airlines metal strap, which carved a piece of tyre off, which was then thrown up into the wing tank, setting up a shock wave. As the tank was full, there was nowhere for it to go other than out through the top of the wing, streaming fuel into the engine efflux. Now, this tyre cut-off did not penetrate the fuel tank. The number 2 engine overheated, but wasn't on fire and was still producing power. The flight engineer ignored normal procedure and shut the engine down. As the aircraft was past V2, he should have allowed the aircraft to gain height before doing that. It is alleged that the French authorities obstructed the UK's VT-ANB investigation, not allowing full and timely access to the crash site and certain evidence. The French prosecuted the Continental Airways engineers for manslaughter, and they unfairly blamed design weaknesses in the Concorde. The engineers were later acquitted on appeal, and this is where much of the hidden evidence came to light. After the trial, the French barrister who successfully defended the engineers was mysteriously found dead, but the French authorities didn't hold an inquest into that. So a very, very interesting episode, Richard.
Yeah, and a double tragedy when a investigator and barrister is found dead.
Yeah. So, Richard, let's finish up with these 2 comments. Michelle Caruth: in a world of corruption and lip service and political games of hiding the facts, subterfuge, dishonesty, outright lying, and not speaking up when called for, therefore trying to pull the wool over the public's eyes, it is so refreshing, to say the least, and not an overstatement, to say how novel it is that in this day and age both of you show the decency so sadly missing in our leaders. Thank you for your moral compass, always pointing to the uncompromised facts. Love from the Pyrenees. And Padre John Ruffle, we hear from Padre John a lot. Thank you for such an excellently put together episode, Richard and Geoffrey. They couldn't have been easy, as you covered so much ground seamlessly. I'm humbled that you quoted my somewhat controversial comment, but most of all, I should say, I appreciate the respectful manner that you incorporate so many worthy replies and comments in each episode. So here's a shout out to all who are committed with Richard and Geoffrey to finding the truth. Gents, your leadership is first class. Lovely comments, Richard.
Yeah, fabulous comments, and thank you for those. And the truth will come out in the end. So we sometimes need to be patient.
We do indeed. So viewers, we're going to take tomorrow off. Sorry about that. We need to take a day off. But look, thank you for subscribing to us. Thank you for liking us. Thank you for your wonderful comments. Thank you for the great questions. And Richard, thank you again for all your effort on today's episode.
You're very welcome.
And viewers, please do tune in on Tuesday. We look forward very, very much to your company. Thank you very much.